Tonight we revisit one case that began as an ordinary advertisement in an ordinary newspaper, 3 lines of print costing a single shilling, and ended as one of the most consequential prosecutions of the entire Victorian era, a case that would eventually force Parliament itself to act, and that still shapes, in ways few people today would recognise, the language of child welfare law in this country. One widow's advertisement, 3 lines long, promising a loving home to whichever grieving, desperate mother happened to read it. 27 separate versions of that same advertisement placed across London's newspapers week after week, month after month. And when the police finally searched the house behind the promise, 9 infants found inside, 5 of them already dying. The case of Margaret Waters begins in Camberwell in South London, in the ordinary aftermath of a husband's sudden death that left a respectable young widow searching for some way to keep herself afloat. Margaret Waters had, by all accounts, lived a genuinely respectable married life in South London until 1864, when her husband died and left her with roughly £300, a modest but real sum meant to carry her through whatever came next. She tried at first to make an honest business of it, setting up a sewing machine enterprise on Addington Square. It failed within its first year, costing her some £250 of her small inheritance through simple inexperience and a market already crowded with competitors selling the same machines at prices she could not match. Sit with that failure for a moment, because it is the ordinary, unremarkable kind of financial ruin that befell countless Victorian widows attempting to support themselves in a world that offered respectable women astonishingly few paths toward independent income. Margaret Waters did not begin her adult life as the woman the newspapers would eventually describe. She was a widow who had tried honestly to build something and failed, and was left afterward with very little and an urgent need to find some other way to live. What she turned to next was lodging house keeping, the same ordinary trade thousands of struggling Victorian women relied upon, renting out rooms to whatever tenants could pay. And from that trade, by a process the surviving record describes as almost imperceptible, one small compromise leading to the next, Margaret Waters drifted into a different and far darker business entirely. She became what her era called a baby farmer, a term that sounds almost gentle to modern ears and concealed, in practice, one of the cruelest trades the Victorian underworld of commerce ever produced. To understand what that term actually meant and why it existed at all, you have to understand the specific and merciless trap facing an unmarried Victorian mother. A woman who bore a child outside marriage in this period faced consequences that could follow her for the rest of her life. Dismissal from domestic service, the loss of family support, a reputation ruined in ways that could close off marriage and respectable employment permanently. For many such women, keeping the child while continuing to work was simply impossible, and the alternatives available to them were desperately few. Baby farming arose to fill that gap, a private, largely unregulated arrangement in which a woman would take in an infant, sometimes for a period of paid weekly care while the mother worked, and sometimes through what were called adoption arrangements, permanently, in exchange for a single lump sum meant to cover the child's care indefinitely. The vast majority of women who took in children this way did so honestly, providing exactly the paid care they had promised, and the trade as a whole served a genuine and otherwise unmet social need. It was precisely because so many baby farmers were honest that the dishonest ones, Margaret Waters chief among them, found it so easy to hide inside a trade the public had no particular reason to view with suspicion. I want you to sit with the specific desperation of the mothers who used this system, because they are as much a part of this story as anyone else in it. These were not careless women abandoning children they did not want. They were, overwhelmingly, women trapped by a society that offered an unmarried mother almost no honourable way to keep both her child and her livelihood, choosing, in genuine anguish, to trust a stranger with the one thing they could not openly keep and could not bear to see suffer for their own circumstances. That trust is precisely what Margaret Waters learned to exploit. Picture the actual walk a young woman in this position had to make, because it is not a scene Victorian society liked to depict honestly. She would have carried her infant, wrapped against the weather, to whatever address a newspaper advertisement had given her, likely alone, likely having told no one in her own family or workplace where she was going or why. She would have handed over a child she had carried and borne, and in most cases genuinely loved, to a stranger she had met perhaps once, on the strength of nothing more than a few printed lines promising a respectable married household and a loving home. And she would have walked away afterward carrying an emptiness that Victorian propriety demanded she never speak of to anyone, an entire private grief she was required, by the strict moral accounting of her era, to bear completely alone. Margaret Waters built her business on the reliable, repeatable predictability of that exact walk, made by woman after woman, each one convinced her own situation was uniquely desperate, and each one, in fact, following a path Waters had already learned to profit from many times before. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Now, back to the record, Margaret Waters' method, once she had settled into the baby farming trade in earnest, was built around volume and a very particular kind of advertising. She placed notices in the Clerkenwell News and other London papers, worded to suggest that a respectable married couple, established and comfortable, wished to adopt an infant into a loving home. It was, in every important sense, a lie built to be believed by exactly the desperate mothers she was hoping to attract. She placed 27 separate advertisements of this kind across the papers, extraordinary volume for a single woman running what was, on paper, one household, and it points to something important about the scale of what Margaret Waters was actually operating. This was not a single unfortunate arrangement gone wrong. It was a deliberate, repeated and highly organised business, run with the volume and the marketing discipline of a woman who had found, in the desperation of unmarried mothers, a genuinely reliable source of income. Notice, too, what the advertisements deliberately chose not to say. They spoke of a married couple, comfortable and established, wishing to adopt, language calculated to summon exactly the picture a frightened mother most wanted to believe in, a real family, a real home, a real future for the child she could not keep. They said nothing of Margaret Waters herself. They said nothing of the volume at which these notices ran, week after week, in paper after paper, a detail that would have told any careful reader that no single respectable couple could possibly be searching for that many infants at once. The Clerkenwell News and its rivals took payment for the notices and printed them without a single question, functioning, however unwittingly, as the essential first link in a chain that ended in a Brixton house crowded with dying children. A newspaper column, priced at £1 for 3 lines, was all the infrastructure this entire scheme ever required. Stay with me through what that income actually required of her, because the mechanics of this fraud are where its true horror lives. A mother answering Waters' advertisement would typically pay a lump sum, commonly around £10, understood as a full and final payment covering the child's care and upbringing from that point forward. £10 was a genuinely significant sum for a working woman of this era, very often the greater part of her own savings, handed over in the sincere belief that it purchased her child a stable, loving future she herself could not provide. But Margaret Waters had no intention of raising that child, or any child, for £10 or for any sum at all. Her actual business model depended on placing the infants she took in with other women, answering her own advertisements in turn, paying those secondary carers only 2 weeks of advance nursing fees before disappearing entirely, leaving the new unpaid caretaker to either continue feeding a child she was receiving no further money for, or to simply let the child's care lapse. If this account is holding you the way it holds me, I would ask you to stay with it, because understanding the full mechanics of how a fraud like this actually extracted its profit is, I think, the only way to properly understand the scale of what it cost. Where Waters herself kept infants directly, in her own house in Brixton, the picture that eventually emerged, once investigators finally began piecing it together from burial records, witness statements, and the surviving children themselves, was catastrophic. Children in her care died in numbers that no honest, well-run nursery would ever have produced, from diarrhea and wasting, the slow, grinding consequences of malnutrition and neglect, and from convulsions consistent with the effects of opiate sedation, a common and dangerous Victorian practice of dosing infants with laudanum or similar preparations to keep them quiet and undemanding. Unable or unwilling to afford proper burials for children whose deaths she had no financial incentive to formally register, Waters resorted to disposing of small bodies by wrapping them in brown paper and carrying them out under cover of darkness to be abandoned in the streets. Other children, still alive but no longer wanted in her household, was simply handed to whatever child happened to be playing nearby, along with a sixpence, while Waters herself disappeared from the scene entirely, leaving an infant in the unsupervised custody of another child, and trusting that no one would ever trace the abandonment back to her door. It is difficult to imagine a more chilling illustration of how completely Margaret Waters had come to view these infants as inconvenient inventory rather than as children disposed of with the same brisk, practical calculation a shopkeeper might apply to unsold stock nearing the end of its usefulness. The scale of the horror inside that Brixton household came to light only because one man made it his singular, dedicated task to find it. Sergeant Richard Relf of the Metropolitan Police became, in the course of investigating Margaret Waters, effectively the first officer in England to specialize in the investigation of baby farming deaths, examining 18 separate infant deaths connected to the Brixton area in the course of building his case. The specialization did not exist as an established branch of policing before Relf effectively invented it for himself, piecing together burial records, advertisement columns, scattered parish reports of infant death into a pattern that no single document on its own would ever have revealed. It was slow, patient, unglamorous work, the kind that produces no immediate arrest and no immediate credit, just only by one officer's private conviction that something in the Brixton infant mortality figures did not add up to simple misfortune. When police finally entered the house where Margaret Waters and her sister, Sarah Ellis, were living, they found 9 infants inside. 5 of them were dying, their small bodies already failing from malnutrition and, the evidence would later suggest, deliberate poisoning with opium to keep them silent and undemanding while whatever money remained for their care went unspent. Sarah Ellis, tried alongside her sister, appears throughout the surviving record as a lesser and more ambiguous figure, present in the household, aware at minimum of the general conditions the children were kept in. though the full extent of her direct participation in the scheme's darkest mechanics remains less clearly established than her sister's. The court's attention and the full weight of its eventual judgment settled overwhelmingly on Margaret Waters herself, the woman whose name had appeared again and again at the bottom of 27 newspaper advertisements. It is a pattern this channel has now traced across more than one case in this series. The woman whose name sits atop the paperwork, absorbing the full public reckoning, while everyone else quietly present in the household recedes into the margins of the historical record, remembered, if at all, only as an accessory to a story that was never truly hers alone to answer for. Margaret Waters and Sarah Ellis were tried at the Old Bailey before the Lord Chief Baron across 3 days, beginning on the 21st of September 1870. The trial drew intense public attention, the details emerging from the witness box, the malnourished survivors, the brown paper bundles left in the streets, the casual handing of infants to passing children for a coin, shocking a public that had, until this case, given remarkably little thought to what actually happened to the infants placed through the newspaper columns they read every day. The jury convicted Margaret Waters of the murder of one specific infant, a baby boy named John Walter Cowan, and on that single provable count she was sentenced to death. On Tuesday, the 11th of October 1870, Margaret Waters was hanged by the executioner William Calcraft in a yard within Horsemonger Lane Gaol, becoming the first baby farmer ever to be executed in England. Calcraft's own long career as an executioner was, by 1870, already notorious for a particular cruelty of method, favouring a shorter drop than more modern practice recommended, one that frequently left the condemned to die slowly of strangulation rather than the quicker death a longer drop would have provided. Whatever judgment history renders on Margaret Waters herself, the manner of her own death carried its own grim echo of the slow, drawn-out suffering that had characterized the deaths of the children in her care. A coincidence the Victorian press of the day did not fail to note in its own unsparing coverage of the execution. Consider what that single conviction for one named child, among what the wider evidence suggested were many more, actually represents. 18 deaths had drawn Sergeant Relf's specialized attention. 5 infants were found dying in a single raid on a single house. And in the end, the legal system of the era could bring one single, fully provable charge to a courtroom, because proving beyond doubt that any specific infant's death among so many uncertain, unregistered, and poorly documented small lives was the direct and deliberate result of Waters' actions, rather than the general, tragic mortality that already claimed so many Victorian infants regardless of their care. It was an almost impossible evidentiary bar to clear. John Walter Cowan's death was provable. How many others, equally real, went into the historical record as simple, unremarkable infant mortality, we will likely never fully know. Try to picture for a moment why John Walter Cowan's case in particular could be proven where 17 others could not. Likely came down to something as simple and as fragile as timing, a mother who could still be located and questioned, a burial record that had not yet been lost or confused with the dozens of other small graves the parish handled that same season, set of dates precise enough to place the child unambiguously in Waters' care at the moment his health collapsed. Every one of those small administrative accidents, present in this single case and absent or unclear in the others, was the difference between a name preserved in the Old Bailey record and a name absorbed permanently into the anonymous statistics of Victorian infant death. John Walter Cowan was not necessarily the child who suffered most under Margaret Waters' care. He may simply have been the child whose death happened to leave behind a trail careful enough to survive into a courtroom. What does this case reveal about the world that made it possible? It reveals a total and catastrophic absence of any regulatory structure around one of the most vulnerable transactions imaginable, the placement of an infant into a stranger's permanent care in exchange for money. There was no licensing requirement for a woman like Margaret Waters to advertise herself as willing to adopt children. There was no registration of infant deaths specific enough to flag a pattern of unusual mortality inside one particular household until a dedicated officer went looking for it directly. There was no mechanism at all by which a desperate unmarried mother, handing over the greater part of her savings and the whole of her child's future to a stranger who answered a newspaper advertisement, could verify a single word of what she was being promised. The entire system operated on pure, unverified trust, extended by women who had nowhere else to turn, toward operators who had every financial incentive to betray that trust as efficiently and as repeatedly as possible. There is a second, harder observation worth sitting with here about exactly whose shame this case actually belonged to. Victorian society placed the full and crushing weight of an illegitimate birth onto the mother alone, offering her no honourable path to raise that child openly and continue her working life, while extending almost none of that same judgment to the fathers who had equally fathered those children and walked away entirely unmarked by the consequence. Margaret Waters did not create that unequal moral architecture. She simply built her entire criminal business on top of it, understanding correctly that a society determined to punish unmarried mothers with total social ruin would also, as an unintended consequence, produce an endless supply of desperate women with no means of checking whether the stranger they were trusting with their child's life was operating in good faith. Follow that logic all the way through, past the individual cruelty of one woman and into the wider architecture of the century that produced her. It becomes genuinely difficult to separate the era's moral judgment of unmarried mothers from the machinery that let Margaret Waters operate at all. Had society offered these women even a modest, respectable alternative, a foundling institution with proper oversight, a form of paid maternity leave, any legitimate structure that did not require total secrecy and total severance from the child, the specific desperation Waters relied upon would have had far less raw material to work with. Instead, the shame was engineered to be so absolute and the secrecy it demanded so complete that a mother handing her infant to a stranger on the strength of a newspaper advertisement was, for many of these women, genuinely the least bad option available to them. Margaret Waters profited directly from a moral system that had already done most of the work of isolating her victims long before a single advertisement was ever placed. The public horror this case produced did, in the end, force a genuine and lasting response. The revelations from Margaret Waters' trial fed directly into the passage of the Infant Life Protection Act, legislation that finally required people caring for multiple infants for payment to register with local authorities, submitting for the first time this entire unregulated trade to at least the beginnings of formal oversight. It did not undo what had already been done inside that Brixton house. It stands, nonetheless, as one of the clearest examples in the whole of Victorian criminal history of a law written directly and specifically in response to one case, one household, and the 9 small lives found inside it. It is worth being honest, too, about the limits of what that first act actually achieved, because registration alone did not end baby farming or the deaths that came with its worst practitioners. Later decades would see further scandals, further prosecutions, and further tightening of the law, a slow, halting process of legislative correction that took the better part of half a century to build anything resembling genuine child welfare protection in England. Margaret Waters' case was not the single moment that solved this problem. It was the moment that forced the problem, for the first time, into a form the state could no longer pretend not to see. The first crude regulatory foothold on a trade that had operated, until that point, in almost total legal darkness. Here is the question I want to leave you with. I would genuinely like to read your thoughts on it in the comments below, because I do not think it has an easy answer. 18 deaths drew Sergeant Relf's specialized attention. Only one could ever be proven in a courtroom to the standard the law required. If the other 17 were, in truth, equally the result of Margaret Waters' neglect and calculation, they went into history as ordinary Victorian infant mortality, absorbed without a name or a formal reckoning into the general statistics of a century that already lost so many of its youngest to disease and poverty. How many more cases like this one, in other houses, under other newspaper advertisements, across the same era of total unregulated trust, were never investigated closely enough by anyone to produce even a single Sergeant Relf, a single provable count of murder, a single name like John Walter Cowan preserved at all in the historical record. Addington Square and the streets of Brixton, where Margaret Waters ran her household, have long since been rebuilt, absorbed into the ordinary residential geography of modern South London, carrying no visible trace of what was found behind one particular door in 1870, no plaque, no marker, nothing to tell the families now living there what once happened inside walls that have long since been demolished, rebuilt and forgotten. The record remains in the Old Bailey trial transcript, in the text of the Infant Life Protection Act that her crimes directly produced, and in Sergeant Richard Relf's own painstaking case notes, the first sustained investigative effort in English policing history, dedicated specifically to the crime of baby farming, a quiet, unglamorous body of work that changed the law of an entire nation. This case still asks a question of us that goes well beyond its own century, and I think it is worth sitting with rather than filing away as a simple period horror. Every era builds its own version of the desperate, unregulated transaction the arrangement a vulnerable person enters into because the honest, regulated alternative has been made too costly, too shameful, too difficult to reach. Margaret Waters found hers in the newspaper advertisement column of 1870s London. The specific mechanism changes with the century. The underlying arithmetic, the desperate person's lack of good options meeting an operator's willingness to exploit that lack for profit, does not, and it is worth asking honestly what our own century's version of that same equation currently looks like, and who is quietly paying for it. Her name was Margaret Waters, a widow who tried honestly to build a business, failed, and turned instead to exploiting the single most desperate transaction a mother can be forced into. She placed 27 advertisements promising loving homes that did not exist, took in 9 children the police would eventually find, 5 of them dying, and was hanged for the one death the law could fully prove among what the wider evidence. Sergeant Relf's own patient and painstaking research strongly suggested were many more. Somewhere between the £10 a desperate mother handed over in good faith and the 6pence Margaret Waters pressed into a stranger's child's hand before disappearing into the London streets is the exact measure of what an unregulated trade in trust actually costs, paid in full by infants too young to have any name in this account beyond the single one the law was ever able to give back to them. and by mothers who spent the rest of their own lives never fully certain what had truly become of the children they had trusted, in their most desperate hour, to a stranger's printed promise.